In this lesson, we're going to be looking at evaluating evidence and how we can make an informed judgment about the evidence that's being presented about global climate change. So first of all, we've got a couple of true or false questions about the greenhouse effect. So as you increase the wavelength, the frequency is increased too. Well, that is false. The greater the wavelength, the lower the frequency, because the frequency is how many whole waves travel past a certain point every second. As you increase the frequency of a wave, the energy also increases. That is true. High frequency, short wavelength waves are higher in energy. Infrared waves are also heat waves. Yes, infrared is heat energy. When energy from IR waves is absorbed by the Earth or atmosphere, the wavelength of the wave increases. Yes, I'm just going to say when re-emitted. That is, of course, true. And now that the waves have less energy, they are trapped in the atmosphere. The temperature of the Earth subsequently increases, and that is true. But I'm not happy with the word trapped there. Remember, it's absorbed by greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor. So we are tackling evaluating evidence from the context of global climate change, and the main sort of consensus around the causes of global climate change is the greenhouse effect. Now, that is not the only explanation for global climate change, and there are a number of other theories. There is no one correct answer. Nobody is saying that it is greenhouse effect and nothing else. There are obviously other contributing factors to the average global temperatures, such as activity from the sun, volcanic activity, and also natural emissions of greenhouse gases from the Earth. So the issue here, I mean, one of the reasons why we can't definitively say that it is human greenhouse gas emissions which are causing the increased global temperature, we can't obviously discount the possibility that there are other factors that are also increasing the average global temperature. But the consensus is amongst the scientific community that the biggest factor is most likely the greenhouse effect, which is obviously being amplified by the production of greenhouse gases by the human species. So what we're going to look at are 4 different articles talking about global climate change. What I want you to do is to read through those articles and really sort of pick them apart. First of all, what is the article really suggesting? What is it suggesting is the cause of global warming? Because these articles are from very different perspectives. What evidence have they discussed to back that claim? And how reliable is the source of that information? So once you've read all 4 articles and basically answered those 3 questions, you should be able to come to a conclusion about what you think is the most reliable explanation for the rise in global temperatures. So before we get on to that, I just want to talk through this. And given the current situation we will find ourselves in, these skills are being able to interpret and sort of dissect information and make a good judge about how valid it actually is really, really important. You're going to see a lot of information about the global pandemic, and not all of it is going to be factually correct, and not all of it is going to be reputable. So you need to be able to make those judgments for yourself. So there are a number of things you need to look out for. Number one, sensationalized headlines. And a brilliant example of this was on Friday. Almost every newspaper in the country was printing about how the lockdown was going to end, and it was the end of the lockdown. And then when it came to Sunday and the Prime Minister gave his speech, the lockdown is very much still in place. So why were all of the newspapers Why were there headlines all saying that it was going to be the end of lockdown on the Monday? Well, you've got to ask yourself, newspapers need people to buy them. So, sensationalized headlines, or sometimes known as clickbait, are a way you have a headline that's misleading, that is not necessarily untrue, but certainly worded in such a way that it doesn't really reflect what's in the article or the actual truth of the matter. So, misinterpreted results, again, this happens all the time, where you have a set of data that has been misinterpreted and actually doesn't show what people think it shows. Conflicts of interest. Now, this is very, very common. You see a lot of studies into global climate change and the greenhouse effect might actually be funded by oil companies. And there is some bias there. I mean, you see a lot. There used to be a lot of studies about lung cancer that were being funded by tobacco companies, because if they controlled the research, then they basically could control the conclusions and the evaluations that came out of that research. So again, look out for conflicts of interest. Are the people carrying out the study, do they have a bias? Correlation and causation. Now, this is really important. Just because there is a correlation between two things does not mean there is a causation. So, in the context of what we're talking about, if you look at a graph that shows the increasing amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the increasing average global temperatures, there is definitely correlation there. As the carbon dioxide is increasing, the global temperatures are increasing, but that doesn't necessarily prove causation. It doesn't prove that the CO2 emissions are causing it. Now, we've got a lot of scientific evidence to back up that it pretty much is, but just from looking at a graph and a correlation does not lead to definitive proof that one thing causes the other. And the example I gave before is if you plotted a graph across the year about the number of ice cream sales, and then you also plotted a graph of the number of cases of sunburn, you would see correlation between those two things. But what you couldn't say is that eating ice cream causes sunburn. Obviously, the two things are not caused by each other, but there is a correlation. So you need to know the difference between correlation and causation. Again, unsupported conclusions. Conclusions perhaps that aren't based on evidence, that might be anecdotal, that might be, I think, rather than the data shows us. Problems with sample size. A very good example of this is if you are perhaps, if I were to trial something perhaps with one class in year 9, and let's say I was trialing a new behaviour policy, okay, and it went really well and it worked really well. I couldn't then turn around and say this behaviour policy will work for all students in all year groups, because I didn't test it in a whole school. I didn't test it across different year groups. I only tested it with one year 9 class. So look out for sample size. If it's a very, very small sample size, it's very, very difficult to scale up your conclusion. So if you were perhaps testing a vaccine, given the situation, and you only tested it on 100 people, can you then scale up your conclusions? Let's say the vaccine worked for maybe 40 out of the 100 people. Could you then scale that up to the millions or perhaps billions of people? Probably not. So, sample size is very, very important. Unrepresentative samples used, okay? And again, that would be a good case. If I go back to the behavior policy one I just said, if I tested a behavior policy on a top set class compared to a bottom set class, or perhaps I tested it on a chemistry group rather than a biology or physics group, could I necessarily say, right, okay, in chemistry we use booklets, that's why the results are better compared to other subjects? Well, actually, that doesn't prove anything. What you'd have to do is take a subject that doesn't use booklets, and for some students give them booklets, and for some students don't give them booklets, and then compare the two, which leads into the control group. You need something to compare it to. So you need, almost like a placebo when they're testing a new medication. They take in the people into the trial and they deliberately give some of them a tablet that doesn't contain the medication, but it's important that they don't know, which is what blind testing is about, because otherwise you do get what we call the placebo effect, where perhaps you have a headache and you take some paracetamol and the headache goes away, but sometimes you could take a sugar tablet if you thought it was paracetamol, and perhaps you might think that your headache has gone away. So it's very important that there is a control group, something that you can compare it to, and a blind testing, so that the people in that control group don't know that they are the control group. Selective reporting of data. Okay, that's we call this sort of cherry picking data. So you've done an investigation and you found out some information, and some of it supports your claim and some of it doesn't. So the stuff that doesn't, you just don't use or you don't include, and you've got to look out for that. Unreplicable results. This is a really important one. When you do an experiment, if you come to a conclusion and you have a data set to support that conclusion, it needs to be something that somebody else could reproduce. If they carried out your experiment the exact same way and did not get the same results, and it couldn't be reproduced, then it is unlikely to be reliable. And finally, this all comes into peer-reviewed material. So when we talk about peer review, and when we talk about our peers, your peers would be the fellow students. So in science, when something is published, when any research is carried out or any experimental findings are published, they are put into a scientific journal, and in order to get published, they need to be checked by other scientists. And we're not talking about 1, 2, or 3 scientists. We're talking about hundreds of scientists, and they're going to look through all of this. They're going to look through, is there correlation and causation? Can the results be replicated? Has the data been fully published, or has it been selectively cherry-picked? Have they used appropriate sampling and control groups? Are there any conflicts of interest? Have they made any unsupported conclusions? And at any point, if there is any doubt in the findings of the scientific article or the journal, then it will be removed. Okay, so peer review is a really, really important mechanism. You can't just write a scientific article and come to a bunch of conclusions and then just get it published as scientific fact. It has to be subject to peer review, which means that the scientific community need to agree with your methods, with your results, with your conclusions. And if there are any discrepancies, then it either won't get published in the first place or it will be retracted. So this is a really, really important mechanism. And if you're reading something and it is peer reviewed, then that is a very, very good sign that it is probably a reputable source of information. So just to recap what I'm asking you to do, and consider all of these things, but fundamentally I want you to read these 4 articles, and I want you to highlight or underline, however works for you, what is the article saying causes global warming, what evidence has been discussed to back that claim, and how reliable is the source. So I've done the first one for you, so you've only got to do the other 3. So here we have Article 1 from the Scientific American, which is a peer-reviewed science journal. So first of all, I went through and looked at where was this information coming from, how reliable is the source of information. So straight away, peer-reviewed journal, very, very reliable. And I read through it, and what they're essentially saying is that the sun cycles through levels of intensity. Okay, so there's the number of sunspots, which is sort of clouds of sort of magnetized plasma that gets shot out from the surface of the sun, and they cause something called the solar wind. And the sun's activity has been increasing, and that has basically coincided with the average global temperatures increasing. So what they're saying is that as the sun's activity has been increasing over the last 11 years, so has average global temperatures. So there's definitely a correlation there. So that's what the claim is. And they're backing that up a little bit by saying, well, we're clear that there has been a increase in solar activity over the last 11 years. We're saying that there has been correlation between sunspots and atmospheric changes on the Earth, such as cloud cover. But then if we look at the evidence they've used to back that up, it is a peer-reviewed journal, but basically all of the argument here about how it is the prevailing cause for the increased global temperature is taken from a blog. Now, blogs are not peer-reviewed. Anybody can write a blog, and there is no requirement for it to be checked or factually correct. You can write more or less whatever you want. It's an opinion. Now, obviously, the man who wrote it is a professor of law, so he's obviously, quite intelligent and probably quite a credible source. But ultimately, it is anecdotal. It is just his views, and he doesn't provide any actual data or evidence to back his claims. So the actual claim here, what are they saying causes global warming? Well, they're saying that it's the increase in solar activity and solar winds which are correlating with increasing global temperatures. And, the source of that information has come from a blog. And in the second half, actually, they talk about the sort of the scientific viewpoint, and scientists that study sunspots and solar winds and solar activity, which again, lots and lots of peer-reviewed studies here, have actually shown that it takes a very minimal impact on the average global temperatures. And actually the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they actually take into account the effect of solar activity on average global temperatures when they are modelling the effect of the greenhouse gas emissions. So the three things we were looking for, what causes the global warming? Well, the increasing solar activity. What evidence has been discussed? Well, the fact that we know that the sun has increased in intensity, and that there is some correlation between that and average global temperatures, as well as some atmospheric changes such as cloud cover. And how reliable is the source? Well, the source of that information is really a blog, which is more or less somebody's opinion, but also the overall source is in a peer-reviewed science journal, and the sort of counter arguments saying that actually it most likely isn't caused by the increasing solar activity, those sources of information are things like the IPCC and peer-reviewed studies, which again are very, very reliable. And the last thing they say is that even if it is a contributing factor, the solar activity of the sun increasing average global temperatures, we can't do anything about it. So if it does come down to, yes, it is the greenhouse effect and increasing CO2 emissions, but it is also the activity of the sun, well, the one thing there that we can do something about is the greenhouse emissions, so the greenhouse gas emissions. So they're saying that the only way that we could ever actually tell if it was the solar activity of the sun would be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And if we reduce greenhouse gas emissions and there is no change in the average global temperatures, then we could then say, then it is most likely caused by the solar activity of the sun. So I've been through and highlighted that. There are 3 more articles for you to go through. And again, you're just picking out those 3 things. What causes global warming? What is the article saying causes global warming? What evidence has been discussed? And how reliable is the source? And then there is a space for you to summarize each article. So for that article that I just went through, what they were saying was the solar wind variations from the sun are the cause of global warming. What evidence did they provide that solar winds have been linked to cloud cover, as well as solar maximum coinciding or correlating with an increase in global temperature? That was the evidence they'd used. And how reliable? Well, the causation is inferred from a blog, However, the counter-arguments were made from peer-reviewed literature and the IPCC. So, what causes global warming, what evidence was discussed, and how reliable was the source? If you do that for articles 2 and 3, and then once you've done that, come up with a conclusion. Based on what you've read, what do you think is the most likely cause of global warming, and what evidence is there to back that up?